그러면 세 번째 세션을 시작하겠습니다. 이 뜻깊은 토론회에 제가 사회를 맡게 돼서 영광이고 기쁩니다. 이 세 번째 주제는 촛불민주주의의 제도화, 촛불민주주의 제도화로 되어 있는데 세 분이 발제해 주시기로 이렇게 되어 있습니다. 세 번째 세션 세 가지 발제가 있는데 첫 번째는 로버트 베데스키 교수님께서 촛불 민주주의와 민중적 입헌주의 다음 국가 패러다임 무엇인가 이런 주제입니다. 그러면 교수님 부탁드리겠습니다.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank Professor Lim for the kind invitation and also for the opportunity for discussing some ideas I've had and the opportunity to apply them to Korea. My first visit to Korea was in 1959. I was stationed at Miyagi and Pyeongtaek. My involvement in Korea has been episodic rather than continuous. And so today I'd like to do something different than we've had so far and to look at the large context, the very larger context of the Candlelight phenomenon and put it in the context of state building the Korean state. What I've done here in this graph is a very rough sketch of Korean state development, looking at Korean history, picking out some key events or hinge events that changed the course of history. You can see, how the two straight lines, the red line represents represents life security of people within Korea. You can see that it starts at 1. People were living, they were struggling, but they were surviving. The dash blue line represents the growth of sovereignty, starting at 0, and in a kind of step fashion, moving to very high security under Shilla, declining under the Mongol conquest, and disappearing at the end. I only go up to 1945 in this chart. Sovereignty disappearing under the Japanese colonial involvement. The Korean state has evolved over 2 millennia. Since 1948, the Republic of Korea has experienced at least 3 different political paradigms and may be transitioning to another one. As the country's political scene possibly enters a new era, the Constitution remains an anchor of stability. Korean politics, while often volatile, takes place within its Constitution, projecting a non-revolutionary and even conservative approach to state modification. Just as a side note, I looked at the North Korean Constitution and the ROK Constitutions of 1948, looking at the occurrence of, first of all, 국가, or compound containing 국가, and is very prominent in both constitutions. So the two Koreas take the state as a concept very seriously, including it in their respective constitutions. The ROK looks at government, 정부, as separate from the state, in contrast to the DPRK mentioning it only once. And I want to keep this distinction between government as an apparatus, as a mechanism for controlling the state, and the state as a conceptual thing. Citizenship is also taken very seriously in the ROK. What I'm saying is that the state is the context of whatever has been happening, not only in the Candlelight movement, but also in all other aspects of Korean politics. Democracy in South Korea has been like the growth of a mountain pine. Its seed was planted in a hostile environment, and its growth to maturity considered unlikely. Its early days were marked by internal conflicts, war, and authoritarianism. A brief flourishing after the heady days of 1960 was smothered by military coup and subsequent repression. 3 more versions of the Republic sought to make military dominance more palatable, but the Gwangju incident and popular reactions climaxed in the civilian constitutional Sixth Republic. Nearly 30 years later, a new stage of state development may be emerging. Revulsion against government corruption and incompetence culminated in candlelight demonstrations and presidential impeachment. Many feel that the democratic institutions were betrayed and that a new social contract may be needed. Intactness of a robust culture and society are necessary foundations for political progress, and the state constitution remains as the expression of a fundamental contract between citizens and government, making civil society a reality. Balancing continuity and change is the challenge of contemporary Korea. In this paper, I will consider the development of the modern Korean state and the evolution of democracy since 1945. This conference's concept of paradigm is particularly useful in this examination as it refers to a framework of analysis linking diverse phenomena into a cohesive pattern. A paradigm should also identify central principles which give it coherence. In this spirit, I offer the following hypotheses. Number one, since the founding of the Republic in 1948, the South Korean state has undergone 4 identifiable paradigms. The first was civilian authoritarianism in the First Republic. Second, parliamentary democracy, the Second Republic. Third, military authoritarianism in the Third, Fourth, and Fifth Republics. Civilian constitutionalism in the Sixth Republic. My second hypothesis is that each paradigm was built on the accomplishments of its predecessor and on rejection of its excesses and failures. In this sense, paradigm succession was a process of conservative, not radical, revolution. Third, the subject of this conference, Candlelight Democracy, has the potential of emerging as a 5th paradigm, which I tentatively call populist constitutionalism. While the populist engagement and emotional momentum of the past year cannot be sustained at a high level, various leaders and organizers will likely continue to apply pressure and influence on the established political parties to be more responsive to demands for good government and concern for the welfare of ordinary citizens. Much will depend on the policies of the Moon administration and external events. All modern politics occurs in the context of the sovereign nation state. The state is a human construction which claims exclusive legal jurisdiction over a specified population and territory. Achieving and maintaining sovereignty is the state's first objective. The second is maintaining and improving life security of subjects and citizens. All men possess a will to life, but only a minority have a will to power, which is necessary to create organizations more complex and unifying than tribes or clans. Expressions of the will to power bring about great good and great harm. Men like Syngman Rhee, Park Chung-hee, Kim Dae-jung, and Kim Il-sung may be reviled or celebrated, but their roles as state makers require an extraordinary will to power to succeed. In the present Korean context, a new elite is emerging, energized by removing President Park, accompanied by popular mobilization under candlelight. Democracy has a way of recruiting masses of citizens into new modes of action and thinking, sometimes displacing the traditional affinity and transforming passive individuals into participants in organizations and movements. The fate of this new and self-selecting populism may be mobilized for extensive reform, but now that impeachment has succeeded and the Sewol incident largely concluded, momentum could be lost. The specter of war always hangs over the peninsula, now as never before. The current crisis may pass or intensify, but its lasting lesson will be that a strong central government is vital for defense of the nation, a fact that will nullify trends in greater democracy. Now, as has been the case for over a century, Korea's destiny is plotted elsewhere. Japanese imperialism, the Cold War, and now North Korean belligerence have more impact on the Republic's future than would a month of daily mass demonstrations. The Korean state is the broadest organization bringing sovereignty and life security to the Korean people. External threats and pressure require a stronger military establishment. Political corruption demands efficient investigation and prosecution from the police and the courts. Environmental protection needs coordinated efforts and resources which only governments can bring. International trade and domestic production depend upon a degree of government support. In other words, the state is indispensable. At the same time, one need only look northward to understand the end point of an all-powerful state, one which completely dominates all aspects of life and where liberty has little substance. The protesters in Gwanghwamun Square were calling for a state less corrupted by private greed and more attuned to the public good to enhance life security. The exigencies of national defense in response to Kim Jong-un's nuclear threats dim the possibility of peaceful reunification or even coexistence, and enhance the role of the military and its tools. The outcome of various scandals, corporate crimes, brittle relations with China, and other events will challenge the fundamental demand of human liberty, which requires limiting the power of the state over its citizens. The irony of candlelight democracy, as I understand the phenomenon, is that its desired result is a more empowered state, not nearly as intrusive as the DPRK, but moving in that direction. President Park Geun-hye was criticized and removed not because of overreaching power, but because she had betrayed the office and served private instead of public interests. Anger over Sewol, anger over the Sewol tragedy was fueled by government failure to oversee safety and to mount timely rescue of the passengers. The mass anger was directed at a state deficit of power, not its excess. The incidents roused demands for more power to the state, not less. So far, there seems to be a consensus that building a strong state administered by honest and limited government has been intrinsic to massive improvement of life security since 1945. Extrapolating state consolidation and economic progress as mutually reinforcing, it seems reasonable to expect state extension along socialist lines should be beneficial, with its emphasis on equality over order and honest government over individual liberty. As a relatively homogeneous and increasingly middle-class society, South Korea has thus far escaped the racial disharmony now prominent in the US, for example. High culture and pop culture seem to prosper in South Korea, while science, technology, and education contribute to a national consensus rare in the world today. A combination of constitutional government, quasi-tribal national identity, perennial security threats, and a modern civil society gives South Korea a solidarity that is unique in the world. The Republic of Korea, as a sovereign state, resembles Japan more than any other nation and might even overshadow its island neighbor if peaceful reunification ever occurs. The bedrock of the Korean state is the 1948 Constitution, a design which has served rather well. It has proven flexible over 7 decades and may even accommodate the newest paradigm, however it may develop. Student and Christian activism are constant factors to agitate and lead in social and political justice movements. Much progress has already been made in women's issues, their presence in the highest offices, for example. Perhaps the proper functioning of government under the Constitution during the recent crisis can be taken as a tribute to its legitimacy and good design. The courts proved their independence, and the unicameral National Assembly acted within the Constitution. There seems to be little support for scrapping or amending in major ways the present Constitution, although we've heard some very good suggestions today. The tarnishing of a president is nothing new. Former chief executives No Tae-woo and Chun Do-hwan were jailed after serving their terms. Park Chung-hee was assassinated by the head of the CIA, and his daughter was impeached. Koreans demand good behavior of their rulers and scorn them when they misbehave. Great power is given tentatively as a trust, and when that trust was betrayed, accountability demanded consequences. A constitutional solution would be to weaken the presidency and to transfer more power to the legislative branch. But the president of the Second Republic gives pause to advocating a parliamentary form of government. Another option is increased federalism, giving provinces more power over local matters. at the expense of the center and cultivating more local democracy. The obvious counterargument is that a strong central government is needed for defense, foreign affairs, advancing the economy, and providing uniform benefits for all society. Surrounded by powerful states, the ROK cannot risk slippage into a decentralized confederation of semi-independent provinces. Every state is an experiment, and the safest course for a new state is to adapt institutions from successful states. The original American state, for example, was an adaptation of the British, while rejecting monarchy and its abuses. In the 20th century, the Soviet state was an original creation, with few precedents of its totalitarian dominance over population and society. The Maoist state was an adaptation of Leninist politics, and the DPRK is a faithful transplanting of the Stalinist state. One likely scenario of the emerging paradigm is increased power of the state, as voters make more demands on government. The Candlelight democracy essentially accelerated, then approved government actions on a chief executive adjudged to have abused her office. It was affirmation of the rule of law, of the supremacy of the state, and a demand that all officials abide by that law whose foundations are in the Constitution. To understand the future course of Korean politics, with Candlelight democracy as the catalyst to further change, I believe the existing Constitution provides the parameters and limits to further institutional evolution. For all the turmoil of the past decades, Korea's constitutional structure has remained fairly intact, except during the Park Chung-hee period, because it has defined three fundamental elements which make civil society possible. These are state, government, and citizenship. One may wish that the original circumstances of Constitution drafting were more propitious. Okay. And that more could have been written for a united Korea. But the emerging Cold War forced American and Korean drafters to save what they could and create a democracy under the coming siege. By inserting the term kukka, it's interesting, in Japan, China, and Korea, the word for state is kukka or kokka or guoja, and the Chinese characters, the hanja, refer to nation, family. So in contrast to the Soviet sphere of influence where the nation was referred to as the fatherland. So we have different concepts, not necessarily in conflict. So there was no mistake in 1948 that it was intended to establish sovereignty and make the case for international recognition as the legitimate entity representing the Korean people. The scope of the Constitution was more expansive than that of the US or Japan. It addressed functions of government and specification of its powers within the state. The 1948 Constitution was no formal document, as the 1936 Soviet or 1948 DPRK basic laws were. Its words and sentiments established a viable democracy which fulfilled their promise in 1987 and have been given fresh momentum this year. The sovereign state is the transcendent entity within which all Korean individual lives are maintained. The state is an all-embracing structure defined by sovereignty, and government is the machinery for carrying out state functions through lawmaking, administration, protection, and enforcement. The objects of state protection government actions are the citizens of the state. The 1948 Constitution was both a declaration of state sovereignty and government design, but carried no presumption of universal applicability. It was intended for use by and for Koreans only, a political contract between state and citizens that remains in force today. How is this relevant to Candlelight democracy? First, there are ample precedents for citizen participation and petition beyond scheduled elections, not only in South Korea, but in other post-war authoritarian and democratic states. Voting is essentially a single individual act, though referencing groups and parties and choices. Its timing and process are regulated by law and are deemed to be intrinsic to fulfillment of the state-citizen political contract. Mass demonstrations, in contrast, are irregular, extralegal, collective, and individual submerging. A government may interpret an outpouring of political sentiment as an uprising or plebiscitarian affirmation. In either case, it cannot be dismissed or ignored, since it represents a challenge or a rebuke to ordinary and legal processes. Some have been successful, others met violent resistance. One possible outcome from Korea is that the state, government institutions, and political parties are made increasingly accountable and responsive to perceived grievances and demands. Authoritarian regimes, in contrast, see mass movements as threats and oppose them with military and police force. While mass phenomena seem to reduce power of the state and increase liberty, they can also enhance government intervention in society by demanding more regulations, more laws, more bureaucracy, and more benefits. The maximum development of state power can be observed in North Korea, and obviously the South is far from that template. Nonetheless, the new government has already shown to be amenable to greater activism. The current budget plan, for example, increased by 7.1% last year, with welfare expenditures increasing by 12.9% and taking up more than a third of the total budget. Socialism may remain anathema to many Koreans, but its central role for the enlarged state may become nearer as government seeks to appease and reform. Thank you very much.